So on this channel we've spoken about servitors, more specifically within chaos magic and even the artificial elemental of the Kabbalistic tradition. So what I want to talk about today is the Alraun, which is the old witch's servitor, basically. It was considered to be a familiar that helped the witch along, gave protection, and things like that. So let's have a look at that. Okay, so the Alraun, if you have actually watched Harry Potter movies, and some of you are probably saying who hasn't, there are actually some people who haven't watched them. But you'll probably remember the scene where they are repotting the mandragores, or the mandrakes, and they come out of the pot and they're little figures that are screaming. Well, I wouldn't say they really scream, although in The Mystic Mandrake, which was written by C.J.S. Thompson, he actually does say that the Alraun was wrapped or dressed in a white robe with a golden girdle, bathed every Friday and kept in a box. Otherwise, it was believed to scream for attention. So, who knows? There is a possibility that when you pull the mandrake out of the ground, you'll get sort of a groaning sound, but I think that's about as far as it goes. Another good movie, if you haven't watched it, is Pan's Labyrinth, and in there, because the mandrake or the Alraun is actually considered to bring easy childbirth, and her mother was having difficulty with pregnancy, and so she actually, with the assistance of the fairies and Pan, she put a mandrake root under the bed and fed it some blood and some milk. So that's just a great scene. And specific to the Alraun or the Mandragore. So if you haven't watched that, watch that. If you have watched the movie Pan's Labyrinth, then I definitely suggest reading the book. It's absolutely brilliant. It's probably one of the best books I've read. It's actually an interpretation of the movie written in book form rather than the other way around. So, but absolutely fantastic book. I was going to show you, but I think my daughter's stolen it. She actually bought it for me. So, yeah, so I think she's stolen it because she wants to read it. So there's obviously a lot of mystery around the Alraun or Mandragore, and I'll get into the difference just now, or the possible difference. When we speak about the Alraun, if you do searches for it and things like that, you'll probably find that it speaks about the mandrake root. Now, this is what people traditionally consider to be the Alraun, but in Mastering Witchcraft by Paul Hassan, I think I'm going to speak about that at the end of the month because that book keeps coming up. He actually defines between the Mandragore and the Alraun. So I'll have a look at that just now. But I mean, the reason you would want to actually create an Alraun, as I said, it's kind of like the old witch's servitor in the same sort of fashion. I wouldn't define it as a servitor. I think that's a bit different. But in the case of the Alraun, it's a familiar. It is a sentient being because you add power into it and you add energy into it the same way you would with a servitor, but it helps you with your magic, it helps protect you, and it brings you good luck. So it's one of those things that the old witches used to use, used to create and used to have around and keep in their hearth. So traditionally, I'm going to now define between the Mandragore and the Alraun, which is mentioned in Mastering Witchcraft. So we're going to talk about the Mandragore first. So this was traditionally, you were supposed to find a mandrake root, which is the opposite sex to you. But this isn't entirely possible. But what you can do is when you get the mandrake, you carve it into a figure, a human figure, which is the opposite sex to you. Now, there are two types of mandragore or mandrake. So there's the Mandragora officinalis, and then there's the English mandragore, also known as white bryony. Now, Paul Husson mentions that the first one, Mandragora officinalis, is also Jimson weed, which is quite well known in America. But I mean, in South Africa we have loads of Jimson weed growing as well. But he also mentions that the English the English mandrake, is the same family as deadly nightshade and the devil's apple or Datura stramonium. But if you look into what Jimson weed is, it is Datura. So I'm not sure where that confusion came in. For me, or to me, Mandragora and Datura are definitely two separate plants. However, you can basically use any root which is tuberous, and you can actually form into a figure. And if you look at the root of the Datura, it is quite tuberous, but it's also quite solid, so it's not soft. So you can actually carve it as you would with wood. So I should imagine that you could use Datura as well. I should probably actually give it a try one day, see what the effects are. Okay, so how do you prepare a mandragore? So just after the new moon, when the moon's waxing, you would go out and you would find a suitable plant, one that speaks to you, and then you would take your athame and you would draw a deosil circle around the plant itself, and then you would take a knife and you would just loosen the soil around a bit, but make sure you don't damage the root. And then you would pull the plant out of the ground, and it's this pulling that creates a bit of a groan as it comes out of the ground. Then what you would do is actually just trim all the foliage off and leave a bit of the root behind, enough to actually create a doll figure, an actual figure that you can carve and use as a mandragore. So don't make it a tiny little piece, make it a substantial amount of the root. And then you would take that home and you would carve the root into the figure of a person. And as I say, this needs to be the figure of the opposite sex to you. And while you're carving, you can chant God, something like guard this home in Hertha's name. Okay, and then what you want to do is plant it. Now traditionally it would be a churchyard or a crossroads, but bear in mind that for the next 28 days you are going to be feeding it. So if you can't get to the location every single day, then don't use a churchyard or a crossroads. You can plant it in your garden, or plant it in a pot. If you've got a balcony, you don't have a garden, then plant it in a pot with soil. Before you plant it, just draw a deosil circle in the soil, then plant the mandrake root or datura, whatever you're actually using, and then for the next lunar cycle, so for the next 28 days, you're going to actually feed it. And feeding, there's two recipes for this, but both of them have distilled water, so make sure you've got distilled water. Personally, I would say that collected rainwater is also sufficient for this. Paul Husson just mentions distilled water. So with the distilled water, you're going to use 12 parts water and 1 part either blood or milk. Now, depending on how much you're actually feeding it, it could end up being a lot of blood, so you can use milk. And then for the next 28 days, you just feed it each day. Okay, and then once the 28 days have passed, just before midnight, you would then draw a diacetyl circle again around the plant, and you would dig up, with the athame, you would dig up the root. And what you'll find is that all the carving scars have sort of repaired, and there's a new layer of bark that's over all the scars and stuff. So then you take that, which is now sort of formed into a mannequin, into a proper figure, looking like a person of the opposite sex to you, and that then becomes your mandragore. So what you do then is you would clean the mandragore and you would then dry it. Now there's two ways to drying it. You can either put it in an oven and put some vervain leaves in there as well, which is sort of a quick drying, or you can pass it through the smoke of vervain leaves each day. That sort of drying can take a long time. It can take up to 3 months, but personally I would say that's actually the best approach. This is something that's going to be with you for the rest of your life. There's an old tradition that if you want to try and get rid of your alrun, you have to sell it for a much higher price than what you paid for it. You don't really want to get rid of it. It's, if you're a witch, it's gonna be a familiar. You're gonna want to keep it around for the rest of your life. According to those traditions, if somebody did try and throw the mandragore away, they'd find it back in their home. You don't want to mess with the mandragore. It will find its way back home. So once you've done that, once everything's finished and the mandragore is ready and prepared, and you can then use it, you would speak to it like you would, speak to it sweetly like you would to a small child. You're going to want to feed it, and to do that you can feed it either milk, honey, or blood, your own blood, nobody else's blood. Don't go killing your neighbours or anything like that. But also bear in mind that the mandragore has the power to bless or curse its owner. So definitely treat it properly, and definitely think before you actually consider doing any kind of magic. Think about the intent you're doing. And then, as I said, Paul Husson mentions or defines between the mandragore and the alrun. So what I described just now was the preparation for a mandragore, according to him. Now the alrun is basically the same preparation, but what you would actually use, you wouldn't use a mandrake root or any kind of root. You would actually go and seek out a rowan or a mountain ash tree, and you actually use a branch. You don't use the root. So you do basically the same thing. So you would draw a diacetyl circle around the tree itself, and then for the next 28 days, the next lunar cycle, you would water the tree every day. And every day as you water the tree, you mentally pick which branch you actually want to use. And the alrun is between like 5 and 12 inches long. So make sure that you have a proper thickness so that you can actually carve a figure out of it. Then you would, after the 28 days, you would then go back and you would actually sever the branch with your athame. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried severing a branch with an athame. It's not serrated. So I'm not sure how they did this traditionally. If somebody can actually show me that, please do. I'd be very interested. So you sever the branch and you then take it home, you carve it into a figure, and you treat it exactly the same as the mandragore. So you would feed it and everything else. However, with the alrun, it's actually traditionally said that it was the alrun was used by warlocks instead of witches. And because of that, it's mentioned that you carve it into a female figure, because a warlock in this instance would be a male. And obviously after you've carved it, then you would treat it with vervain smoke. But then traditionally what you should do is take it to bed with you on the full moon, and make sure you're constantly facing it right through the night, and you sleep with it as if it were your wife. So that's the Alraun or Alrun that is spoken about by Paul Hesson in Mastering Witchcraft. It's one of those really, really interesting topics, and something you might want to consider doing, especially if you're into traditional witchcraft and the old ways. And if you do decide to actually create a mandragore or an alrun, let me know, because I'd love to hear your experiences. And that's it for this week, or today. It's Tuesday, so I will see you on Friday. Have a good one. Cheers.